That's right. I'm recording a podcast and videocast about how to protect podcast and videocast names. As my kids would say, this is super meta. I actually get asked all the time about how to protect podcast or videocast or YouTube channel or other video channel names. And they are brand names and trademarks just like any other. In fact, you may have noticed this podcast, when it's in audio format, is called Tricks of the Trademark. And it is registered with the US Patent and Trademark Office. I looked this morning and it turns out I've filed more than 36 trademark applications over the years for podcast and videocast names. I want to share with you some of my favorites that are creative names. One is in the field of lacrosse, and it's called Unbuckled Chin Strap. Another is from a gentleman in Brooklyn, New York, who has a wonderful, booming podcast voice, and it's called Brooklyn Baritone. I was going to try to say it in his voice, but I can't do it justice. The nice thing about that is it has the alliteration of the B sound, Brooklyn Baritone. Another client of mine has a podcast called Drop and Give Me 20. And she's a military veteran, and her content is designed primarily for military veteran entrepreneurs. So Drop and Give Me 20 is playful. It's suggestive of some of the content. And I love it because when you hear that name, like you can sort of visualize somebody dropping and giving you 20 push-ups. So I think that's a really smart, creative name. It conveys an image. Another podcast name that I've appeared on and protected, and my friend Chad Barr, B-A-R-R, who's helping me record this right now, is called Raising the Bar. That's a wonderful play on words, double entendre of the bar. So a creative, playful, registered podcast name. Another great alliteration is called Dinner and Dialogue. That's a podcast where the host sits down for dinner and has a chat with a person in the community or a celebrity. I love the alliteration there as well for Dinner and Dialogue. So those are some examples of some of my favorite podcast names that I've worked on. But my point is that podcast names are just like any other brand name. They are for a service. You don't have to be generating revenue from it immediately or tangibly to have enough commerce to justify registering it as a trademark. My podcast, I've never charged $1 for it. I've never made any money from advertising on it. It is, of course, promoting my services in general, and it's available on the internet, and that's all that is necessary to qualify for trademark protection. Of course, it has to meet the other qualifications through the application process, just like any other brand. When it comes to applying for and registering for podcast and videocast services, the one tricky thing that we have to look out for in the process is how to describe the goods and services, because there are several different categories that it could fit into. By categories, I mean the classification of products and services at the USPTO. So without getting too wonky and in the weeds, a downloadable podcast that you download on your phone is categorized differently by the USPTO as an actual product, even though it's just bits and bytes. It's categorized differently as the streaming of a podcast online via a service like Spotify or through a website. Now, in the end, that nuance is not terribly significant in terms of the protection, but it is something that has to be addressed and prepared for in the application and throughout the process. So if you have a podcast or a videocast or you're launching one and you want to talk about brand names and protection for it, find me at Tricks of the Trademark podcast or ericpelton.com, and happy to discuss. Thanks.